Hewlett Johnson was an enormously colourful character, a charismatic character. He was dean here for over 30 years during the period of World War II. So he left a great legacy for this cathedral, and he's remembered locally with great affection. He also had strong political views, and that didn't sit very happily with some other members of the chapter here in Canterbury.
He was in love. It was a love affair. And his love affair wasn't really with people, it was with ideas. It was with the idea of communism.
What the Dean really does present is a puzzle. And what he really does show us is that in an age where we tend to see someone as good or bad sometimes wrongly, he does present this very blurred grey image.
He wanted things to be good. He always tried to see the best in people, and he wanted to see the best in what Russia and Stalin were doing.
After in 1 year, he had a personal conversation with Stalin and a personal conversation with the President of the United States. And he was the only person in the world really who did that.
Over the next 100 years, we might see him written back into history books because he is clearly a seminal figure in 20th century history, which is testified to by, there's countless photos and archive material that draws out his relationship with the likes of a Castro and an Eleanor Roosevelt and a Gandhi and a W.E.B. Du Bois and all these luminaries, these giants of the 20th century. He shared platforms with them.
Because his interests were so wide-ranging, from women's rights, American civil rights, nuclear power, the arms race, there's got to be something to take out of it.
Hewlett Johnson was born in Manchester on the 25th of January 1874 to Charles and Rosa Johnson. The sixth of 9 children, Hewlett was born into economic prosperity, his father owning a successful factory by the name of Johnson's Wire Works.
His family were the epitome of Victorian capitalism. They made a lot of money through the exploitation of labour in Manchester in the late 19th century. And the family itself lived in absolute splendour out in the lovely Cheshire countryside.
The Johnson family was deeply religious. Hewlett himself was named for his maternal grandfather, Dr. Alfred Hewlett, a successful preacher famous locally as the Spurgeon of the North. It was from this devoutly religious upbringing that Johnson first developed his strong Christian faith.
But the family was also actually very Christian in what I think we would now call an evangelical way. So Hewlett, and it was a large family, there were about 9 children altogether, I think. So Hewlett and his brothers and sisters were brought up in actually quite a strict Christian family, but a very wealthy family, a very privileged family.
Despite what his future in the clergy would suggest, Johnson's early academic pursuits were not of theology, but of the sciences, and in 1890 he would attend Owens College to study civil and mechanical engineering.
And he did his first degrees plural, in civil and mechanical engineering. And he graduated as a fully qualified engineer, with a view then to going into the family business. But his father, probably quite rightly, said, no, before you come into our family business, you've got to learn the ropes on the factory floor. So having graduated with qualifications in civil and mechanical engineering, he then went as an apprentice to another, even bigger, heavier engineering firm in Manchester, Ashburys, that made railway carriages. This was the heyday of the railways. And he spent 4 years on the shop floor at Ashburys, in all the dirt and muck and squalor, actually learning quite literally, not metaphorically, the nuts and bolts of heavy industry. And he always said it was while he was on the floor, the shop floor in the factories at Ashburys, that he was mixing with unskilled and semi-skilled men who were working in the most appalling conditions, Victorian factory sweated labour, on a pittance of money in which they had to bring up their large families. And it was really on the shop floor at Ashburys that Hewlett Johnson was converted, first of all to socialism and then I think to communism, because he realised he had the conscience and the insight and the empathy to realise the huge gulf between his own family's privilege and the fact that they enjoyed their privilege because of the labouring poor of Manchester who were generating the wealth. And I think that was when the scales dropped from his eyes.
The only thing that did grab my attention was the fact that he does start off as a scientist, as an engineer. The fact that he actually puts the work in on the factory floor as well kind of spoke a lot about the sentiments that he then grew up with and tried to impart upon others. Grew up in this very privileged lifestyle, let's not pretend he didn't. And there are flashes of Engels about his background, very much so. And I just found that interesting, that he's like so many other kind of liberal socialists of that time period that actually come from quite a privileged background. Yet you see not a full rejection of it. You see him reject it temporarily, but then fully embrace the upper middle class life.
He did understand that core tenet of Marxism, which is that Marx and Marxists are, or find, centering a political system on property ownership is problematic and causes great inequality, and that he's someone who's moved by the poverty that he sees in places like Manchester, and he wants to create a better world. So I also see him as that kind of progressive Marxist, and one that sits in that sort of humanist tradition.
He was very hazy about terms. He never read much politics. I don't think he'd ever read Marx or Engels. And he used phrases like socialism and communism rather loosely, certainly more loosely than political scientists would. But anyway, we kind of know what he meant. He just said, capitalism creates utterly unacceptable inequalities between the wealthy who own the capital and the labourers who generate it but own nothing. And that was his conversion as an apprentice at Ashbury's, and that philosophy, that political philosophy, never left him.
Johnson would eventually leave Ashbury's in 1898 and join his brothers in working at his father's factory for the next 2 years. However, the wireworks was not enough to occupy all 6 of the brothers at once, and as his siblings left for greater things, so did Hewlett, applying to become a lay missionary for the Church Missionary Society.
He was set for an engineering career. He'd got his degrees in civil and mechanical engineering. He'd done a 4-year apprenticeship. He had excellent references. And for reasons which I haven't been able to discover, he didn't then go into the family firm. I don't know why he didn't. But he set his sight then on becoming what was called a lay missionary with the Church Missionary Society. So the idea was that he would go out to some parts of the empire, because of course this was the heyday of the British Empire, and the idea was that he would go out as an engineer and perhaps work on local railway constructions, that kind of thing. But he would also be a lay member, a non-ordained member of the missionary teams. So that was the idea. So he applied to be a lay engineer missionary, and essentially he was told, well, look, you look okay on the engineering side, but you're a bit weak on the theology side. So the Church Missionary Society sent him to Oxford for a year, to Wycliffe College, where he did, I think it was a diploma in theology, to give him the theological side to complement his engineering skills and experiences.
I mean, the contradictions I think in him are embodied straight away from the fact that he is a scientist and a theologian at the same time. And yes, in the past, people like Isaac Newton have been able to marry the two quite well. He stands as someone that I think is kind of a 20th century version of that.
During his time at Oxford, Johnson met Mary Taylor, who also aspired to become a missionary. The two quickly grew close, and Hewlett proposed to her later that year, before his course had even finished. After finishing his course, Johnson returned to the Church Missionary Society and once again applied to become a lay missionary.
So he did that. And then he went back to the Church Missionary Society and said, here I am. And they said, well, we think it might be a good idea if you actually did a degree in theology. So he went back to Oxford, to Wadham College, where he did an undergraduate degree. He took only 2 years over it. By this time, he was pushing 30. He was sort of getting on. He'd never actually earned a penny in his life. He was being funded for all of this by his father. So then he went back to the Church Missionary Society again and said, look, I'm such a rounded man, you can't possibly turn me down. And they did turn him down. And I think the reason was that by this time he was becoming known for his radical views and particularly for his left-wing views. And his views about social justice and egalitarianism and his anti-capitalist views. And this didn't fit with empire. Empire was about going out to the benighted areas, preaching the Christian gospel to the natives. And by this time, Hewlett-Johnson's theology was much more subtle. He was asking questions, are the words that are attributed to Jesus in St. John's Gospel really Jesus' words? Well, that's not what the Church of England wanted the natives to hear. They wanted to hear the straightforward Christian gospel of submission to the empire. And Hewlett-Johnson already actually couldn't do that.
With becoming a missionary no longer an option, Johnson instead opted to become ordained, hoping to serve as a curate to an impoverished parish.
By now he was getting very well known for his left-wing views. He was beginning to explore what we would now call liberal theology, which was beginning particularly in Germany in the late 19th century. And he thought he'd try a poor parish in the East End of London, which he thought would give him the scope to get engaged in real anti-poverty action, living among the poor and trying to improve the lot of the poor, whilst at the same time being a clergyman. And he couldn't find a parish. And then suddenly the Bishop of Chester, whose son, the bishop's son, had rowed with Hewlett-Johnson in the Wadham 8, the boat, the 8. So this is still the establishment at work behind the scenes. The Bishop of Chester parachuted Hewlett-Johnson into one of the richest parishes in England, Altrincham, which was an extraordinary thing to do, because here was a radical young firebrand priest being parachuted into a church. Altrincham is now where all the Manchester United players live. It's one of the wealthiest areas in Greater Manchester. At that time, it was filled with people like his father, the owners of the mills and the factories and the mines that were making their profit, as his father did, from the grime and squalor of the Victorian factories and mines. And here was this young firebrand priest parachuted into one of the richest parishes in England. The Church of England works in extraordinary ways.
During his time at St. Margaret's, first as a curate in 1905 and later as its vicar in 1908, Johnson involved himself heavily in the community of the parish and its issues. He fought for the poorer residents of Altrincham to the council on issues of health and public housing, and organised regular summer camps for the children of poor families.
He would talk about the conditions in Altrincham, which was his first parish, how the difference between the big houses, the wealthy industrialists who lived at the top of the hill near his church, and the people who lived at the bottom of the hill, the working class area, never enough money, sickly children because of the pollution which hung around the bottom particularly. I think that started him thinking about it, but he came from a family that was very socially aware, although his family was, as it were, at the top of the hill.
It was at this time that Johnson would become increasingly well known for his radical views, espousing a form of Christian socialism in his sermons, and publishing The Interpreter, an academic journal in which Johnson discussed the political and theological as one, and in which he made public his socialist beliefs. Johnson's political activities would catch the attention of MI5 when, in 1917, he held a meeting to celebrate the October Revolution and its establishment of communism in Russia.
MI5 opened the file on him in 1917. So at this time he was vicar of Altrincham, and this was the time of the Russian Revolution, of course, well, particularly the October Revolution. Hewlett-Johnson thought this was fantastic. This was absolutely wonderful. This was almost the second coming of Christ. God's kingdom was about to break on earth. So Hewlett-Johnson organised a meeting in Manchester, and it was very well attended, and the meeting was called to pass a vote of congratulations and good wishes on the people of Russia in overthrowing the Tsar and establishing communism. And Hewlett-Johnson found a young philosopher mathematician to be the principal speaker, very well known for his left-wing views, and that was Bertrand Russell. So Hewlett-Johnson got Bertrand Russell to Manchester, to the Free Trade Hall. Police were all along the back row of the Free Trade Hall. And here was Hewlett-Johnson, sort of almost whipping up the masses. He was a wonderful orator. He and Churchill were the two great orators of the 20th century, saying how wonderful the revolution in Russia was. And so MI5 thought, well, we better keep an eye on this chap.
It's not that out of the ordinary, if that makes sense, because when you look at how MI5 were treating a lot of known sympathisers to the East in the 50s and 60s, they're all under surveillance at some level, whether it be socialist academics like Christopher Hill, for example. They were being watched, notes were being kept on them.
Johnson's career in the Church of England would develop when, in 1924, he became a Doctor of Divinity and was later appointed as Dean of Manchester Cathedral.
I think by the time he became Dean of Manchester, his politics and his churchmanship were fixed. I don't think they changed. So that determined the kind of ministry that he set for himself. And, in a sense, he took from his ministry in Manchester and Canterbury everything that enhanced his political and social and theological outlook. And he tended not to be terribly interested in anything that contradicted it. So, I think he was one of those people. We see them in all walks of life. And there's a kind of arrogance there. Having arrived at what is right for them, they're very reluctant to change, and anybody who doesn't fit in with those views, tends to be slightly marginalised. And I think Hewlett-Johnson was guilty of that. I think there was a touch of arrogance about him. The nice way of putting it might be to say there was a touch of the showman. He was a showman. He courted the media. He was a terrific exploiter of media attention. He wasn't averse to all sorts of gimmicks to catch the public attention. He revelled in the limelight. He grew his white hair shoulder length because it was so distinctive. I mean, he was an ecclesiastical showman, and he was very, very good at it.
He was an actor in many ways. The big services in the cathedral were splendid occasions. And I think he enjoyed all that, the magnificent copes, the choir, the music.
He also loved the uniform, didn't he? He wear his gaiters. That he.
Yes, I mean that in a way was part of the love of attention, because when he became dean, first of all in Manchester, deans at that time wore black clothes, sort of like a frock coat almost, and gaiters, and he kept that up right up to when he retired. People used to look, oh my goodness, what's that chap doing? It was well known in Canterbury, but he did get some funny looks sometimes in London and other places. But he enjoyed that.
When the cathedral wasn't bombed, but the precinct was very seriously bombed, and very brave fire officers threw incendiary bombs off the roof and so on. And the Archbishop came out of his palace to see what was going on, wearing a dressing gown and pyjamas. And the Dean came out immaculately dressed, as always, wearing his gaiters. And the Archbishop said, "I will not believe this. You are even at a time like this, you're the best dressed Dean in England."
We know he's thought of by Hughes, isn't he, to some extent, and many, as something of a peacock. And I think that was in part confirmed, wasn't it, by Keziah, that he did enjoy the limelight. I think Butler seems to draw that out as well in his work. And you can see that, particularly in the photos in the archive, that he's always there with a beaming, broad smile, and he seems terribly proud and pleased of himself. And he seemed to love all the pomp and pageantry, even just his vestments, his clothes. He clearly was something of a show-off. So definitely he's kind of blinded by dazzling lights to a certain extent. But underneath that, very much, I think there's someone who's committed to the socialist cause.
Appointed by a Labour government, Johnson felt that it was his duty to utilise his position to espouse socialist principles. While his position as dean meant that he was too busy to continue publishing The Interpreter, He contributed frequently to the Manchester press, praising socialist policies in Sweden and Italy. As in Altrincham, Johnson involved himself heavily in the issues of the community and campaigned to reduce pollution in Manchester, a concern for the environment not often found in his contemporaries.
He pioneered what I think is now called the concept of the civic dean. That is to say, the dean of the cathedral, we call him the Dean of Manchester, but in fact, of course, he was Dean of Manchester Cathedral. But he really did become the Dean of Manchester. In other words, he not only ran the cathedral, which is the primary job of a dean, but given his background in Manchester, given his knowledge of all the social networks in Manchester through his parents, given his understanding of poverty in Manchester, and there was a great deal of it, he did everything he possibly could to improve the life of the poor. And he focused particularly on air quality. Because Manchester was surrounded by mines, and because of all the smoke belching out of the factory chimneys, the air quality in Manchester was atrocious. And it was particularly affecting children. I don't know, half the children in Manchester had coughs and wheezes and asthma and so on. And so it's only one example. He was engaged in all sorts of areas of civic life, as well as running the cathedral. But trying to do something about air quality was really, sort of what he pinned his civic mission around. And he did it with some success, actually.
While he found himself prospering in Manchester, Johnson's contentment would soon be disrupted by personal tragedy when, in 1930, Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer. Despite surgery, her cancer only worsened, and she died in January 1931.
And Hewlett Johnson was devastated. They'd worked together as a couple, and now suddenly he was on his own. So, and he began to feel that not only had he lost a wife, but he'd also more or less done everything he felt he could do in Manchester. Apart from his years in Oxford, he spent all his life in Manchester, in what we would now call Greater Manchester, of course. And he just felt bereft and the need for change. And it just so happened that at about the time that Mary died, the current Dean of Canterbury, Dick Shepherd, was forced into early retirement through ill health. He'd been Dean here for only 18 months. So it was the concatenation of events, Hewlett Johnson needing to move on, Canterbury becoming vacant. And I think there were two people who saw how to match those two up. One was William Temple. William Temple at that time was Bishop of Manchester when Hewlett Johnson was Dean. Temple went on to become Archbishop of York and then Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, during the war. And Temple had worked with Hewlett Johnson at Manchester. Temple knew what Hewlett Johnson could do. And Temple, who himself had very, very left-wing views, and there's no doubt about that, clearly thought that this left-wing firebrand minister, fired by a sense of social justice, is just what the complacent South needed. So he was one. The other was the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, Labour Prime Minister. And when the idea came up that, well, perhaps this high-profile left-wing priest could come down to genteel, complacent Canterbury and shake them up a bit, Ramsay MacDonald said, "Great, we'll get him in."
Johnson would be installed as Dean of Canterbury on the 12th of June 1931, and, while he welcomed the new position for the change it provided, he quickly found himself out of place in Canterbury, especially among others in the cathedral's chapter.
So he was a surprise appointment in many ways. He was from Northern England. He wasn't of the more traditional background, university background of previous deans. He replaced a dean called Dick Shepherd, or he succeeded a dean called Dick Shepherd. He also had strong political views, and that didn't sit very happily with some other members of the chapter here in Canterbury.
So in the summer of 1931, Hewlett Johnson came here, and he was immediately rejected by the cathedral community. Completely rejected by them. The cathedral community here was complacent, Edwardian, intellectualised Oxbridge. They were all Oxbridge graduates, living very, very comfortable lives. They were all Southerners. And who was parachuted into their midst? A Northerner, a grammar school boy. He didn't go to Eton or Harrow, he went to Macclesfield Grammar School. A grammar school boy with a background in industry, with pretty liberal theological ideas, being tracked by MI5. Is this really what we want in Canterbury? And this complacent Edwardian, elitist public school in Oxbridge chapter just closed its ranks against him.
While the chapter at large treated him with hostility, his relationship with the Archbishop Cosmo Gordon Lang was a friendly one, although the two would eventually come to disagree strongly on political issues.
Cosmo Gordon Lang was the Archbishop at the time when Hewlett Johnson was appointed, and he was pleased with the appointment and he supported Hewlett Johnson. And although they had their differences, in general, the relations between Hewlett Johnson and Lang were cordial until Lang's retirement.
He was a nice archbishop. I'm not sure he was terribly effective. He never married. He was quite a homely sort of man. And he actually did get on very well with Hewlett Johnson. He despaired of Johnson. He never understood him. But they did actually have quite a good relationship.
In Canterbury, Johnson could not find the same level of involvement with the community as he had enjoyed in Altrincham and Manchester. The day-to-day activities of cathedral life were managed for him, and he felt isolated from the wider community of the city. Denied a role in local affairs, Johnson pursued involvement in global politics and began meeting regularly with the Russian ambassador to the UK, Ivan Maysky, in order to learn more about the Soviet regime.
It is a bit secretive, actually, but the evidence in the archives is that they clearly not only had a political philosophy in common, but the chemistry between them obviously worked. They got on very well together. Maysky often came down to Canterbury. Hewlett Johnson often made trips to the Russian embassy in Kensington. I think it was through Maysky that Johnson was recruited by the Kremlin as a propagandist in the West. So Maysky knew what he was doing. Maysky was a very cultured man. He fitted in well with a Western way of life. He spoke many languages, and the two men just got on so well with each other. But I think it eventually became clear that Maysky never understood Johnson, because in the archive there's a letter dated, I think, probably around about 1960, in which he said to Hewlett Johnson, I just valued everything you did, but I could never understand how you could be a Christian minister and an apologist for Stalin. So Maysky, the Russian ambassador who was close to Stalin but eventually was imprisoned by Khrushchev, Maysky, in spite of being very close to Johnson, he could not understand how Johnson could at the one and the same time be a Christian priest and also an apologist for Stalin and all his murderous works. And that kind of says it all, I think.
Johnson's next foray into wider politics would be even more controversial, inviting Mahatma Gandhi to stay at the deanery during his visit to the UK in 1931.
Well, it was one of the very first things he did in 1931. Gandhi at that time was public enemy number one of the British Empire, and Gandhi came to England, and Johnson invited him to come to Canterbury, and Gandhi did. And we've got some extraordinary pictures of Gandhi rolling up outside the deanery in a Rolls Royce, and out stepped this little man in his white robes. He brought his own goat with him because he would only drink goat's milk, so the goat got out of the Rolls Royce as well. And Hewlett Johnson was absolutely thrilled, and Johnson immediately took Gandhi into the Cathedral for Evensong, and Gandhi sat in the canon's stalls in the choir. And of course the chapter were absolutely outraged because, Gandhi was the public enemy number one of the British Empire. It was still the British Empire in 1931.
Hewlett Johnson brought Gandhi to the cathedral and indeed writes about Gandhi's great interest in the service and in the hymns. And Hewlett Johnson arranged for a reception at the deanery for him. But that reception was boycotted by the canons who didn't feel it was appropriate for Gandhi, who was, of course, involved in the movement for India's independence from the British Empire, the then British Empire. The canons didn't feel it was appropriate for him to be welcomed to Canterbury. So it was an example of the tensions that developed, and it did indeed cause a further rift between the Dean and the canons.
It's quite incendiary, I think, at that point in time to let the Mahatma stay with him and to welcome him so warmly, as I believe he should have. But of course, this was a point in history where Gandhi would have been seen, I don't know if using the term terrorist is strong, because we know that he's someone who practices satyagraha and passive civil disobedience and civil resistance. Nevertheless, he was an enemy of the state. He was a potent threat to the jewel in the crown. This was our most prized colonial possession. And Gandhi was the man who was going to bring all that tumbling down. So for someone of the Dean's standing to welcome him in, I think it's very brave of the Dean, and surely to some extent that must have helped Gandhi's cause, that he had this sort of high-profile figure within the Anglican Church willing to receive him.
Despite the chapter's reactions, Johnson would take yet another step into international politics later that year, visiting China for 5 months on a fact-finding expedition in order to bring international attention and aid to the country after its devastation at the hands of war, flooding and famine. While there, Johnson witnessed both the beauty and the brutal repression of China under the Republic, and in his account of the visit, Johnson described witnessing a suspected communist executed in the street. In the years following his return to Canterbury, Johnson would work to reorganise the cathedral and introduce reforms to its statutes, introducing sabbatical leave for the canons and giving overdue pay to contractors. Johnson would also face new opposition from the chapter upon his return, in the form of Canon John Shirley. Shirley had been appointed headmaster of the King's School, to which Johnson was head of the governors. The two were strongly opposed politically and often struggled to work together.
John Shirley was a very driven, ambitious, strong-minded man, in many ways like Hewlett Johnson. And John Shirley was a canon of the cathedral, so a clergyman, as well as headmaster of the King's School. And John Shirley did an enormous amount to turn around the fortunes, the financial fortunes of the King's School. But he most certainly clashed with Hewlett Johnson. As Dean of the Cathedral, Hewlett Johnson was chairman of the governors of the King's School. So the two organisations, Cathedral and School, and the individuals, so the Dean and the headmaster, had quite complex relations.
I think the simplest way, it's the oversimplest way of explaining it, is that here were two absolutely huge egos, and the precincts was not big enough to accommodate two enormous egos. In principle, they were supposed to work together because the King's School is part of the new foundation of the cathedral, and the Dean is ex officio chair of the governors of the King's School. So it's a relationship that's supposed to be very close, and normally is actually. But Shirley objected fundamentally to Hewlett Johnson's politics. Shirley was appalled that Johnson was being tracked by MI5, and really just right from the beginning, these two enormous, huge egos. It was like two sumo wrestlers just clashing into each other.
It was during this time that Noel Edwards would begin living in the deanery. Noel was Hewlett's second cousin and had come to Canterbury to study art. Noel stayed in the deanery with him during her studies, and the two quickly became close.
I think it's a lovely story. Hewlett Johnson's first wife, Mary, died in 1931. In the summer of 1931, in July, Hewlett Johnson came as Dean of Canterbury as a recently widowed, fatherless man, first time living in the south, rattling around in the deanery, the huge deanery on his own, ostracised by his chapter. Very, very difficult. But he had a cousin whose daughter, Noel, had known Hewlett, or Hewlett had known her, for all their life. So she was 32 years younger than him. and she'd lived in Manchester, and she'd always known Hewlett throughout her childhood as Uncle Hewlett. He actually wasn't. He was actually her second cousin, but it was that sort of relationship. And Noel was a very gifted artist, and she came to art school in the south of England. So it was natural for her to stay with Hewlett Johnson in the deanery. Nobody thought anything of it. For goodness sake, she was 32 years younger than him. She was his second cousin. He'd known her since she was a baby. And in fact, the chapter breathed a sigh of relief. Hewlett's been a bit lonely since he came down here. Thank goodness he's got a woman in the deanery who can look after him a bit and, all of that sort of thing. And that's how it was. Nobody thought it was in the least bit odd. But then in 1938, Hewlett suddenly said, well, we're engaged.
Hewlett and Noel's relationship would soon develop into a romantic one, and the two became married in 1938.
She was very much younger, and she was a second cousin once removed, something like that. She'd known him pretty much all her life, and he'd been very supportive to her family. Her father was a vicar who became ill, had to employ a curate, money was very tight, and I think he helped out sometimes with that. One of her brothers was killed in a motorcycle accident, and he was extremely supportive to the whole family then. So she, at that stage, had looked on him very much as a sort of almost substitute father figure. But then later on, when he became dean, and she got to know him because she was doing copies of one of the cathedral tapestries, and she also painted his portrait to hang in the deanery because each dean left a portrait. And she got to know him then, and they gradually fell in love. And I think they had a very happy marriage. But obviously, politics intruded on this.
Well, of course, he was 64, she was 32. It was a huge scandal. And the invective, the gossip, the malignancy that was flying around the precincts was, pretty awful.
I think her happiest time was probably when they were fairly recently married and came back to the deanery, which was obviously a beautiful house at that time, very well furnished, with maids. She said she was told, you don't get up and draw the curtains when it's getting dark. You ring the bell and a maid will come and do it. And so she was briefly into that sort of life. And then the war came along and they were separated for about 5 years, apart from very brief visits. And then coming back, there was an awful lot of political problems and uproar. So I think she was very happily married to him. I think the outside events made life a lot more difficult for her. But I don't remember her complaining particularly.
And it was a very happy marriage. It was a blissfully happy marriage. Hewlett adored Noel, but she was never comfortable in the deanery simply because her husband was continually being vilified. Almost every day they opened the newspapers and somebody in the right-wing press was saying something hostile.
It was during this time that Johnson first met Alfred de Eye, a socialist lecturer in the Workers' Educational Association. The two quickly became good friends and intellectual peers, and de Eye would go on to collaborate with Johnson in his future writings.
He's a mysterious figure. He had a huge influence over Hewlett Johnson. There's no doubt about that. They must have met, I think, pretty well as soon as Johnson came to Canterbury in 1931. Dye was an academic, he was a political scientist. Rather like Hewlett Johnson's relationship with Maysky, the Russian ambassador, immediately the chemistry between Hewlett Johnson and Alfred Dye just clicked. And Hewlett Johnson wasn't actually an academic man. He peddled ideas, he talked a lot about communism, but he'd never read very much. And in terms of a knowledge of academic political science, it was, kind of zilch. But Alfred Dye provided that. Dye knew all the sort of academic and theoretical underpinnings of socialism and communism. So I think Hewlett-Johnson saw in Dye somebody who could provide the academic justification for what he was trying to do at a very practical level.
I remember him as my godfather, who was a very nice godfather who used to give good birthday and Christmas presents, particularly books. He was. I've still got one or two of the books he gave me, and they were good. He was a bachelor. He didn't have much to do. He never had children of his own, so he had a rather grown-up attitude towards this. He again was very confirmed in his views, and if you tried to talk to him, it was a bit like switching on something which then went on and on and on, and you couldn't really quite get what he was saying.
Why was Dye interested in Johnson? Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know the answer. There was always a suspicion that Alfred Dye was a Kremlin plant, that he was a Svengali in Hewlett-Johnson's household. And Dye lived in the deanery with Hewlett-Johnson right through the war, and they remained very close after the war. And there's no doubt that Dye smoothed relationships with Russia for Johnson. Dye helped Johnson to write his sermons. Dye provided the academic underpinnings for what Johnson was saying about communism. And there was always the suspicion that Dye was a plant. And there's one reference to Dye in the MI5 folder in Kew. Dye always said he'd never been to Moscow. The MI5 record says he did. What does that tell us? Really not very much. It's circumstantial. But there was always this idea that Dye wasn't quite what he seemed, that he was there to make sure that Hewlett-Johnson was fed propaganda, to make sure that Hewlett-Johnson used it effectively, to create easements and links between Johnson and the Kremlin. Those allegations were often made. I haven't discovered any proof that that was the case. So I think, from my point of view, I'd have to say that remains speculation.
I mean, I liked him, but again, he was difficult to know, and I know there've been queries as to whether he was a KGB agent. I can't give any enlightenment on that point at all. I've no idea.
Yeah, he's the mystery man, isn't he? But, assuming that he'd have access to the same Vox propaganda. So, and we got that impression from Keziah that they obviously were terribly close and in cahoots, and I would have thought they were just sharing that load. I would imagine, he's a pretty busy guy, so on top of all the sermons and services that he had to conduct, it kind of makes sense that in part it would be co-written with Dye, but I can only imagine that Dye's got the same source of information as the Dean would have had. But it was interesting to draw out quite how much of the world had gravitated towards Moscow's orbit, that it wasn't a flash in the pan, that international communism, unfortunately in that Soviet bastardized form, was incredibly, popular. It was a dominant ideology, and no wonder that a Cold War was raging.
In 1937, Johnson visited Spain as part of a religious delegation, invited by the Republican government to report on conditions and counter the claims that they had been oppressing Christians.
On their honeymoon, they went to Spain. Because he wanted to see what was happening and to learn, what was going on there.
Your mother said that they ran a nationalist gauntlet to get into Barcelona, I think it was.
His main memory was of being in a little village called Durango and watching the German Luftwaffe bomb the hell out of Durango. They were watching, he and a number of other people watching from the outskirts of the town. And Durango was the next village to Guernica, and Guernica was the next town that went. So, Hewlett-Johnson was sort of kind of right in there, and he became absolutely incensed because Franco's troops put a barricade around Bilbao in northern Spain. So it was very difficult for food and armaments to get through.
The nationalist propaganda claimed that the bombing had been done by the Republicans, and this was fake news. It's just like with Ukraine today. It hadn't been bombed by the Republicans, it was by the Luftwaffe. And Hewlett was able to do a broadcast to correct this. So, echoes of today, as I say.
And of course, initially it was sort of passed off as this was Republicans causing all this carnage, and yet we know obviously these were Luftwaffe supplied weapons. And of course, this set precedent for World War II and the tactic of blitzkrieg. And I think what impresses me is that we know the British government in particular was going to make it illegal for people to go and support the anti-fascists in Spain. And this is at a point that's literally just a couple of years before the outbreak of World War II. And I think I find that fascinating that we had this attitude towards fascism, that we were willing to appease it. And the Dean was willing to stand up for, I guess, that Republican and democratic movement. And I think it goes deeper than that, we were willing to facilitate and support fascism effectively. If you look at the role that Midland Bank played, now HSBC, in financing the fascist movement. And yet we've got the Dean, who was under, as we said, much criticism, in part because obviously churchmen at times were attacked, and it was seen as, just ridiculous and embarrassing that a man of the cloth should stand up for republicanism. But actually, I think history has proven that he was on the right side, and that the church in England, and certainly the government in England, stood with and appeased fascists, and that really should be called out.
Lots of people went from England to Spain, almost always fighting on the partisan side. Hewlett-Johnson never fought. He went as a witness, as an organised group. But again, that sort of reinforced his deep hatred of fascism, and particularly Nazism. And that was 1937. Even at the time, a lot of people said, well, this is the dress rehearsal for a world war, and so it proved. But it was part of this theme of reinforcing in Hewlett-Johnson a deep hatred of fascism and anything to do with fascism.
Upon his return to Britain, Johnson would publish his findings, that he had witnessed no persecution of Christians by the Republicans, and that it was the nationalists who had dropped bombs on Durango. His account was largely dismissed by the press, however, and Archbishop Lang publicly expressed his disapproval of Johnson's claims. Johnson would not stay in the UK for long, and later that year he left to visit Russia. His trip was arranged by the All-Union Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries, or VOX, a government organisation responsible for the spread of pro-Soviet propaganda to foreign countries, especially in the West. Johnson received a guided tour of Russia's industrial cities, and, while little else is known about the trip, he returned with the belief that the Soviet Union was on course to becoming the perfect society.
Well, I think the thing that grabs me most about that, other than the sort of photos we've seen of, all the amazing kind of public works that he visits, it's the year that I find most telling. In Soviet circles, that number was whispered. It was the year, as you pointed out, 1937, but the number 37 was effectively code, and it stood for the Great Terror and the purges that engulfed the Soviet Union from sort of 1934 to around 1938. Obviously, there'd been terror as well prior to that, and phenomena like dekulakization. But this is at the point when Stalin's arbitrarily drafting and writing these lists of numbers that he wants to see disappeared and executed. Russia is a literal hellscape at that point in time, and Hewlett's there, and he sees or hears nothing of it. And I think that's what's most striking. It is akin to being in Nazi Germany, isn't it, at the height of the final solution, and being utterly oblivious to it. Perhaps it shows the strength again of Soviet propaganda and how well sort of curated his visit was.
He's shown what they want to see. Basically, it's a cleverly coordinated event, and this is abundantly clear when you look at the photographs that he takes and brings back. You see what they want you to see. You see the work created by the camps. It's fantastic to go around these cities and see what wonders they have created, but he completely ignores the context. The provenance of these places is that so many were built on the backs of Gulag slave labour. He sees in China the camps being dug and doesn't question it, and that's what's really curious to me. He's an inquisitive person in all of his books, in his sermons, probing, asking, yet the questions that are blindingly obvious that are in front of him, he shies away from.
But yeah, astonishing that he's there at the height of the Great Terror, and all he has to say is to speak to the wonders and marvels of the Soviet experiment, and therein lies the reason in part he's forgotten from history, and that he's seen as this apologist, because how could he ignore it? But I guess he ignores it because he's not seeing it, he's not shown it. It is well covered.
He was given an awful lot of fake news. This organisation Vox, which was a Russian propaganda tool, really, to try and spread good news about Russia to England and other countries, and they were very clever. You think of advertising techniques and selling techniques. You know, they had all that sort of thing, and they were obviously very good at it. And unfortunately, my father wasn't questioning enough. And looking back with hindsight, I think he should have probably investigated this sort of thing a bit more. It was a sort of confirmation bias that, he wanted things to be good. He always tried to see the best in people, and he wanted to see the best in what Russia and Stalin were doing. And so when somebody gave him news of these wonderful collective farms and how people had enough to eat and how the children went to school and all the rest of it, he was only too ready to believe it.
Following his return from the Soviet Union, Johnson and de Eye were commissioned by the socialist publisher Victor Gollancz to write a book explaining the Soviet Union to the West. The book was titled The Socialist Sixth of the World, or Soviet Power in the US, and, while not widely read in Britain, it soon became popular in other countries, being read by Cuban revolutionaries and Helen Keller alike.
Well, that takes me back to the point on Vox, really, again, that I'm not really sure that he writes an awful lot of that. I think he's largely reprinting material. We know it's hugely successful globally, or at least many copies of it are run. I guess that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bought and consumed. But, in places like Cuba and other socialist satellite states, it is well received, but as it would be by those that were pro the Soviet Union. But I think it's largely just a regurgitation of Soviet propaganda, and I'm not sure that his brain was particularly engaged in that enterprise.
They kind of come across as not so the most academic of pieces at times, but they are engaging, and you can understand it if he's like that, plus the showman in speeches. You can understand why people flock to him.
I think what confuses me, that if he had read more Karl Marx, he would have seen that and understood that Marx saw the dictatorship of the proletariat as something temporary and transitory, that it was supposed to disappear, and that therefore this the state that's created under Lenin in part and then Stalin would have been anathema to Marx. And I just kind of wonder what kind of Marxist he was, that had he not read enough of Marx's work to read that kind of nuance. I guess he read the propaganda being produced by Stalin and bought that and didn't seem to be investigating much deeper himself.